I almost ignored the price alerts on my monitor this morning, and honestly, if you're shopping for a TV right now, that would have been a massive mistake. Everybody is getting hyped up for the new 2026 LG C6 and B6 models dropping next week. The marketing is relentless right now. They desperately want you to pay full MSRP for a new processor and maybe, 100 extra nits of peak brightness you'll only ever notice on a test pattern? But behind the scenes, retailers are absolutely panicking. They have to clear out last year's inventory before the March Madness tournament tips off. I'm looking at the 48-inch LG B5 sitting at $649, half price, and the 65-inch C5 just took a $1,300 nosedive. That is pure insanity for a flagship OLED. Hi, this is Chris Walker. Look, I don't take sponsorships from these TV brands because I need to be able to look you in the eye and tell you exactly when to skip their shiny new tech and buy the clearance models instead. If keeping $1,000 in your pocket matters to you, hit subscribe so we can keep this independent testing going. Let's look at why this price crash is happening right now, and more importantly, what you are actually giving up if you decide to pull the trigger today instead of waiting. Let's talk about the calendar. March is the absolute most dangerous time to walk into a Best Buy or browse Amazon if you don't know what you're looking at. The new 2026 models, the C6, the B6, the G6, they are actively on delivery trucks right now. Retailers are squeezed. They literally do not have the warehouse square footage to hold the 2025 C5s and B5s alongside the new boxes. So they panic, and when retail panics, we win. But the brands, LG, Samsung, Sony, they don't want you buying last year's model, so they spin up this massive marketing machine about how the Alpha 11 processor in the C6, or the supposed 165 Hz refresh rate, is going to completely change your life. Look, I've been testing these panels for years. Let me tell you a little secret about the TV industry. Year-over-year OLED panel improvements are basically microscopic at this point.
Let me explain that better. When you see a commercial shouting about 20% brighter highlights, you naturally assume the whole TV is 20% brighter. It's not. They're measuring a tiny 2% window on the screen, like a flashlight beaming in a dark scene or a star in the night sky, for literally a fraction of a second. That's it. That's the upgrade you're paying an extra $1,000 for. Meanwhile, the real-world brightness, the full-screen brightness when you're watching a hockey game or a snowscape on a Sunday afternoon with the blinds open, it's almost exactly the same as last year's model. Why? Because of physics. Heat. If an OLED pushes too much light across the entire panel at once, the organic compounds will literally cook themselves and burn in. So the TV has a built-in self-preservation system called an auto brightness limiter, or ABL. It aggressively dims the picture to save the panel. A new processor doesn't change the laws of thermodynamics. Unless you're stepping up to the massive, expensive G series with a physical heatsink bolted to the back, your new C6 is going to dim just like a C5. Which brings us to the $649 elephant in the room, the 48-inch LG B5. I had to refresh the page 3 times when I saw this price. $649 for a brand new 0-hour OLED panel? 2 years ago, a 48-inch OLED at this tier would have easily set you back $1,200 to $1,300. So what's the catch? Because there's always a catch. The B series is LG's entry-level OLED, and the most critical thing you need to understand here is that it doesn't use the EVO panel found in the C series. It's using an older sub-pixel architecture. In a pitch-black room, you'll never notice the difference. The contrast is infinity. The blacks are true ink-spilled black because every single pixel turns off completely. It looks incredible. But if you put this TV in a living room with a giant south-facing window, you're going to be miserable. The B5 simply doesn't have the sheer luminance punch to fight through midday sun, and the anti-reflective coating is, well, it's just okay. It's not magic. Dark scenes in movies will turn the TV into a giant $649 mirror. You'll be watching your own reflection eating popcorn instead of the movie. And there's an even bigger trap hidden on the back of the TV, the ports. The B5 uses a slightly downgraded processing chip compared to the C series. Because of that bandwidth bottleneck, it only has two fully fledged HDMI 2.1 ports that can handle 4K at 120 Hz for modern gaming. Now, you might be thinking, Chris, 2 is fine, I only have a PS5. Wait. Think about your audio setup. One of those two high-speed ports is also the eARC port, the audio return channel. If you use a modern Dolby Atmos soundbar, it has to plug into that specific port to get the high-res audio from your TV. So your soundbar eats port number 3, your PS5 eats port number 4. What happens if you buy an Xbox Series X next year, or a high-end gaming PC? You are out of high-speed ports. You will literally find yourself reaching behind the TV in the dusk, physically swapping cables every time you want to switch consoles if you want to keep that 120 Hz refresh rate and variable refresh rate active. For a lot of people, that daily UI friction is a total deal breaker. It's exactly the kind of hardware limitation that drives me crazy. Actually, I want to hear from you guys on this one. Jump into the comments right now and tell me, are you running multiple consoles in your setup, or are you strictly a one-console household? Does the two-port limit actually matter to you? While you're down there, let me know what soundbars or AV receivers you want me to tear down and test next month, because I'm building out the new test bench right now, and I want to buy what you guys are actually shopping for. Let's talk about the day-to-day experience of actually living with the B5, because out of the box, the honeymoon phase is great, but by month 3, things start to annoy you. LG's WebOS interface. I used to love it. The magic remote with the little Nintendo Wii-style cursor is great, but over the last 2 iterations, it has become incredibly bloated. When you turn on the B5, 60 to 70% of your home screen is now just a giant billboard for sponsored content. It feels heavy. The older processor in the B5 means that navigating through these heavy, ad-laden menus isn't always buttery smooth. You'll press the home button and there's just a half second of stutter.
Is it the end of the world? No, but it's that subtle UI friction that reminds you bought the budget model. My honest advice, if you buy the B5 at $649, take $50 of the money you saved, buy a standalone 4K streaming stick like an Apple TV or a Chromecast, plug it in, and never look at LG's built-in operating system again. It bypasses the processor lag entirely. So, the B5 is the aggressive budget play. It's the ultimate bedroom TV or the ultimate darkroom single-console gaming monitor. For $649, if you understand the port limitations and the brightness ceiling, you are stealing it. But if that port situation feels like a trap, or if you actually want to put your TV in a room with, windows, this next deal is where the math actually starts to get deeply interesting. Because while the B5 is a great entry point, the 65-inch LG C5 dropping by $1,300 changes the entire landscape of the mid-range TV market. When we step up from the B series to the C series, we cross a very specific engineering threshold. The C series is historically the sweet spot for about 90% of the US consumer market, and for good reason. First of all, you get the EVO panel. This isn't just a marketing buzzword, it's a physical change in the deuterium compounds used in the organic pixels. It allows the TV to get noticeably brighter, especially in full-screen white scenes, without drastically increasing the risk of burn-in. If you like watching hockey, or if you play games with bright static health bars, that chemical stability matters. It's the difference between your panel degrading gracefully over 7 years versus starting to show faint ghost images of the ESPN ticker by year 3. And then there's the processing. The C5 uses the Alpha 9 series chip. The motion handling on this, how it cleans up low bitrate, highly compressed garbage from YouTube or a standard 1080p cable box, is vastly superior to the B5. People completely misunderstand this. They buy a 4K OLED, they plug in their standard cable box to watch a football game, and they get mad that it looks blocky and pixelated around the players. They think the TV is broken. It's not. The TV is just accurately displaying a terrible bit-starved signal. The Alpha 9 processor in the C5 has dedicated hardware to smooth out that macro blocking and color banding. It acts as a digital janitor.
Let's talk about the physical build and the realities of mounting this thing, because I see buyers make a critical mistake here all the time. The C5 is incredibly thin at the top. I mean, it's basically a pane of glass. It looks gorgeous in a showroom, but all the electronics, the power supply, the processing board, the inputs, they are all housed in this bulky plastic hump on the bottom half of the back. If you are planning to use an ultra-slim zero-gap wall mount, you need to measure carefully. That lower hump pushes the top of the TV slightly away from the wall, and because it's so thin at the top, if you try to adjust the viewing angle by grabbing the top corners and pulling, you can literally flex and crack the panel. I have seen it happen. You always adjust an OLED by grabbing it from the thicker bottom section. It sounds obvious, but when you spend over $1,000 on a screen, you don't want to find out the hard way that you bent it. Now, let's talk about the C5's massive price drop. At roughly $1,399 for a 65-inch, the value proposition here is almost unbeatable. You're getting 4 full-bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. You can plug in your soundbar, your PS5, your PC, and still have room to spare. You get the brighter Evo panel. You get the better digital cleanup. But wait, what are you sacrificing by not waiting for the C6 next week? The C6 is bringing a supposed 144 Hz or maybe even 165 Hz refresh rate for PC gamers. Look, I'm a gamer. Unless you are running a liquid-cooled PC rig with an RTX 4090, you are not pushing modern AAA titles at 4K resolution at 144 frames per second. For console players, the PS5 and Xbox Series X max out at 120 Hz hardware limits. The higher refresh rate spec on the C6 is purely theoretical headroom for 99% of buyers. It's a spec sheet flex designed to make you feel like your tech is outdated. It's not.
The other heavily marketed C6 feature is the Alpha 11 AI processor. It promises better AI sound upmixing and slightly refined tone napping. In my side-by-side thermal and visual testing of the older and newer chips across similar LG models, the difference in everyday viewing, unless you are pausing the movie and pressing your nose against the glass to find micro artifacts, is nearly imperceptible. So you have a choice. Pay roughly $2,600 plus for the new 65-inch C6 and tell your friends you have the latest AI chip, or buy the C5 right now on clearance for $1,399, get 98% of the exact same visual experience, and use the $1,200 you saved to buy a killer surround sound system. To me, that math is a no-brainer. But if the C5 is so incredibly solid, why would anyone spend more? Why does Samsung's QD-OLED exist? And why are home theater purists completely obsessed with Sony right now? If you thought the B5 versus C5 debate was interesting, the bloodbath happening at the high-end enthusiast tier is even crazier. We need to look at what happens when you introduce quantum dots into this equation, because it completely breaks LG's hold on the market. Let's talk about the exact moment LG stopped being the only game in town. For years, LG Display basically owned the OLED patent. Every brand, even Sony, had to buy panels from them. But a couple of years ago, Samsung engineers locked themselves in a lab and came out with something called Quantum Dot OLED, or QD-OLED. And if you're cross-shopping that $1,300 LG C5 right now, you are almost certainly looking at the Samsung S90e sitting right next to it for maybe a couple $100 more. Here is the physical reality of what separates these two technologies and why it actually matters in your living room. LG's traditional OLEDs, what they call WOLED, use a white subpixel to cheat their way to higher brightness. When an explosion happens on screen or a bright sun ray peeks through the clouds, the LG panel turns on that white pixel to blast light. It works, it gets bright, but, and this is the crucial trade-off, it washes out the color, it dilutes the saturation. A bright red sports car driving through a sunlit desert on an LG C5 can sometimes look a tiny bit pinkish or pastel in the absolute brightest highlights.
Samsung's QD-OLED throws that entire concept in the trash. There is no white subpixel. They use pure blue OLEDs firing through a quantum dot color filter. The results? Actually, wait, let me put it this way because the spec sheets won't tell you this. When you watch an animated movie like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse on a Samsung S90e, the neon colors and the bright scenes don't just get brighter, they get deeper. The color volume is physically thicker. It is a stunning, punch-you-in-the-face visual experience. For PC gamers and absolute color purists, QD-OLED is a drug. Once you see a high luminance red or green on a Samsung panel, going back to a standard LG C-Series feels just a little bit muted. But before you run out and buy the S90e, we have to talk about the hidden tax of owning a Samsung TV in 2026, because there is a massive catch. Two catches, actually. First, Samsung absolutely refuses, point blank, out of pure corporate stubbornness, to pay Dolby the licensing fee for Dolby Vision. They push their own competing format called HDR10+. Now, if you look at the back of standard Blu-ray boxes or check the streaming tags on Netflix and Disney+, 90% of the industry has adopted Dolby Vision. If you buy the S90e, your TV will default down to standard HDR10 on most movies. Does it ruin the movie? No, but if I'm spending over $1,500 on a cinematic display, I want the panel to process the exact dynamic metadata the Hollywood colorist intended frame by frame. I don't want a generic HDR fallback. I want to know what you guys think about this down in the comments. Are you actively avoiding Samsung because of the Dolby Vision boycott? Or do you think Dolby Vision is just an overpriced licensing scam that most people can't even see the difference on? Let's argue about it, because frankly, it drives me insane that a premium TV in this era is missing standard format support.
The second catch is living with Tizen OS. Samsung's operating system is, in my opinion, a daily friction point. It is cluttered, it is entirely too focused on serving you Samsung TV Plus channels you never asked for, and finding basic picture settings feels like solving a puzzle box. You hit the little gear icon on their minimalist solar-powered remote, and instead of just giving you a brightness slider, you get kicked into a side menu, then a sub-menu, then an expert menu. And let's talk about the physical screen itself for a second. QD OLED panels do not have the same polarizing layer that traditional LG OLEDs have. If you put the S90e in a room where a window is directly opposite the TV and the sun hits the screen, the ambient light actually interacts with the quantum dots even when the TV is off. The pitch black screen turns a faint purplish gray. Your perfect infinite contrast gets slightly elevated by the sun. If you are a darkroom movie watcher, the S90e is a masterpiece. If you have French doors behind your couch, you are going to hate it. Which brings us to the absolute heavyweights. What happens when you have a bright room, deep pockets, and you refuse to compromise on either brightness or longevity? You enter the G series territory, the LG G5 and the incoming G6. If you look at the price tag of a 65-inch LG G5 right now, even on clearance, you're looking at roughly $2,400 to $2,500. That is a massive leap from the $1,300 C5. So what on earth justifies a $1,000 premium for the same size screen? Two pieces of physical hardware, micro lens array, and a massive slab of aluminum. Let me explain the heat problem first, because it dictates the lifespan of your investment. OLED pixels are organic. When you run them bright, they get hot. When they get hot, they degrade. When they degrade unevenly, you get burn-in, the permanent ghost of a CNN logo or a health bar permanently scarred into your glass. The LG C5 has no physical cooling system. It relies entirely on software to dim the screen, that ABL we talked about, to save itself. The G5 is physically built differently. It has an actual dedicated thermal heatsink laminated to the back of the panel. When you touch the back of a G5 after a 2-hour HDR movie, it is noticeably warm. That is a good thing. It is pulling the heat away from the organic material and dissipating it. Because of that heatsink, LG can drive the panel significantly harder without destroying it. But they didn't stop there. They added micro lens array, or MLA. This isn't software. It is billions of microscopic convex lenses stamped directly over the pixels. In a normal TV, a lot of the light generated by the pixel bounces around inside the glass and gets lost. It's wasted energy. MLA physically focuses that scattered light and shoots it straight out into your eyeballs.
The result is staggering. The G5 can hit peak brightness levels that make the C5 look like it's wearing sunglasses. It cuts through living room glare like a blowtorch. And because it's using lenses to harvest wasted light rather than just pumping more electricity into the pixels, it does this while maintaining incredible panel longevity. LG is so confident in this thermal design that they actually slap a 5-year panel warranty on the G series. You don't get that on the C5. But, and I see people make this mistake every single week, if you order the G5, you need to understand exactly what comes in the box. There is no stand. Zero. The G stands for gallery. LG designed this TV specifically and exclusively to be bolted flat to your drywall. It comes with a proprietary recessed wall mount that folds perfectly into a cavity on the back of the TV. When you install it correctly, there is no gap. It sits flush like a painting. But installing it correctly is a nightmare if your studs aren't perfectly centered where you want the TV. It is heavy. The recessed cable routing requires you to have an in-wall power solution. If you buy the G5 thinking you're just going to pop it on your media console, you are going to be staring at a $2,500 piece of glass leaning awkwardly against your wall until you go back online and spend another $150 on an aftermarket pedestal stand. It's a premium product that demands a premium permanent installation.
If that sounds like too much work, or if you just want the absolute, undisputed, uncompromised king of picture quality regardless of price, we have to talk about the Sony tax, the Sony A95L. It is currently sitting at around $3,499 for a 65-inch. It uses the exact same underlying Samsung QD-OLED panel technology as the S90e. I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone pay almost $2,000 more for the Sony if the glass comes from the same factory? It's the brain, the Sony Cognitive Processor XR. Look, we all want to believe we only watch uncompressed 4K Blu-rays, but the reality of US consumer habits is that 80% of what you watch is heavily compressed, bit-starved garbage. You're watching an NFL game streamed over a struggling Amazon Prime app. You're watching a 1080p rerun of The Office on Peacock. You're watching YouTube videos shot on a smartphone. When you feed a messy, low-quality signal to the Samsung S90e or the LG C5, they do an okay job, but they will still show color banding, those harsh, blocky steps between shades of black in a dark room. Sony's processing is practically forensic. It analyzes the image, identifies the compression artifacts, and smooths them out using a database of visual textures. A gritty, dark episode of House of the Dragon streamed on max compression looks entirely different on the A95L. The near black handling is flawless. There is no flashing, there is no blockiness. It just looks like film. Add in the fact that Sony physically vibrates the glass panel to create sound, their acoustic surface audio, meaning the dialogue actually comes directly from the actor's mouth on screen instead of a downward-firing speaker at the bottom bezel. It's an incredible piece of engineering. But here is the absolute unforgivable truth about the A95L that makes it so hard for me to recommend to regular people. For $3,500, a price point where you should be making zero compromises, Sony only gives you 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. It uses the older MediaTek Pentonic chipset, so just like the budget $649 LG B5 we started this video with, if you have a soundbar and 2 gaming consoles, you are physically unplugging cables on a $3,500 flagship television. That is the kind of hardware limitation that feels like a slap in the face to high-end enthusiasts.
So, we have the aggressive B5, the sweet spot C5, the colorful S90e, the blazing hot G5, and the exorbitant Sony A95L. You've got the data, you see the trade-offs, now let's cut through the noise, build the final buyer profiles, and lock down exactly which of these you should actually spend your money on before these clearance prices vanish entirely. Let's group these up so you don't make a mistake at checkout. If you were putting a TV in a dark basement or a bedroom and you only own one gaming console, the 48-inch LG B5 at $649 is the greatest steal of the year. Period. Just remember the glossy screen reflection. If you have a lamp directly behind your viewing chair, you will see the bulb staring back at you during dark scenes. Keep the room dark, and it's a masterpiece for the price.
If you have a modern, open-concept living room with huge windows and you refuse to draw the curtains on a Sunday afternoon, you have to skip the budget tier entirely. You need the thermal headroom of the LG 5. Just please measure your wall studs before you buy it. And remember, you have to buy an aftermarket stand if you aren't drilling into drywall. Now for the home theater snobs, and I say that affectionately because I am one. If you want that QD-OLED color punch and you do not care about Dolby Vision, the Samsung S90e is stunning. But honestly, if you're chasing absolute perfection and you have an unlimited budget, the Sony A95L is the processing king. You just have to swallow the bitter pill of paying $3,500 to reach behind the TV and manually swap HDMI cables. But for 95% of the people watching this video, here is where the math actually settles. The best overall TV, the absolute undisputed champion of this March Madness fire sale, is the 65-inch LG C5 at $1,300. It gives you the Evo panel brightness, all 4 high-speed HDMI ports, and it doesn't force you into a proprietary wall mount. You're getting flagship performance for mid-range money simply because a warehouse manager somewhere is panicking about the incoming 2026 boxes.
Here is the truth bomb the TV industry hopes you ignore this month. The new C6 coming next week? It is a software update disguised as a hardware revolution. The human eye cannot detect a 5% bump in peak brightness without a reference monitor sitting right next to it, but your bank account will absolutely feel a $1,300 difference. Actually, let me be even more blunt about this. If you pay full retail for a 2026 OLED this spring, you are basically subsidizing the marketing budget for a company that is currently giving last year's buyers the exact same visual experience for half the price. Don't be the person who buys the hype. Buy the hardware. I've put links down in the description to the exact clearance models we talked about today. These are vetted sources that guarantee you are getting brand new A-stock panels, not refurbished returns or models with sneaky revision traps. If this breakdown saved you from a bad purchase, hit subscribe, drop your soundbar requests in the comments, and I'll see you on the test bench next week.